Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to AJ117, Introduction to Terrorism and Homeland Security. My name is Tony Farrar, and I am going to be your instructor for this semester. This is going to be our Chapter 1 lecture covering defining, conceptualizing, and understanding terrorism. Now, we have a lot of content to cover, so let's go ahead and just jump right into our weekly lecture. So I told my niece, who totally loves Legos, that I would work in some type of Lego photo into my first week's lecture in every one of my classes. So I found one that kind of fit with what we're going to be talking about, which is, of course, defining and understanding terrorism. So here's my work in for my niece. So there you go. I've satisfied that thing I need to do. I also added in something that I thought would be really interesting for you to watch. If you have time, go back and watch this TED Talk. And it's basically the son of an actual terrorist who talks about a story of choice, knowing what his father was like and what he wanted to do, which of course is completely different. So I think you'll find it very interesting, and it will also help you understand perhaps why a terrorist might think the way they do. Some of the things that come out in his discussion are very profound. So take a look at that if you have time, and the link is at the bottom of the page. All right, so to begin, on June 17th, 2015, 21-year-old Dylan Roof attended a prayer service at the Emmanuel African Methodist Church, a historically African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina. Roof, who was not a member and he was white, he sat for a bit, and then he pulled out a handgun, subsequently killing 9 people. And when he was arrested, he allegedly stated that his motive for the killings was race. And here is a photo of Dylan Roof after he was taken into custody and being taken to court. Now, many called the incident an act of domestic terrorism. The Department of Justice, however, contended there was no political motivation for this attack, which was a requirement in order to bring a charge of terrorism. So instead, Roof was charged with a hate crime. And you can see a couple of pictures that were taken off of his social media page that does kind of implicate the fact that it may have been more than a hate crime. But what I'm trying to get at before we jump into our actual, the meat of the lecture, is that a lot of times we misuse the term terrorism because we don't actually know what the definition. And in addition, these definitions, they also have elements that have to be proven, just like any crime has elements. And if you can't prove the elements, then it's not going to rise to the level of the crime, etc. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. But instead, again, this was in fact a hate crime. Now, terrorism, intelligence, and homeland security are 3 words that consume today's news events. No other issues are so prominent, so compelling, or so critically important to our communities and our nation than these 3 separate but interconnected topics. And some argue that as a nation we are still suffering from the lingering effects of the attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, an event that clearly changed our world forever. On that day, our security weaknesses were exploited, our vulnerability was exposed. Our fear became real. For the last decade and a half, we have struggled to dramatically improve the security of our homeland from attack, whether these attacks are from aircraft hijackings or indiscriminate bombings, from a land attack, or whether these attacks are from, shootings, even the use of, chemical radioactive agents, or more sophisticated attempts to infiltrate our critical infrastructures or deny services through the use of let's say, cyber attacks. So in this chapter, what we're going to look at is, or discuss, will be the reasons why it is important to understand terrorism. How do we define it? And how do we conceptualize it from historical as well as a contemporary viewpoint? So more important, we're going to look at the problems and issues involved in understanding such an evocative or emotional and political term, and the role that individual perspective, culture, and religion also plays in conceptualizing or thinking about terrorism. So with that said, it is important, perhaps essential, to understand terrorism. Now, there are a number of reasons why it is important to understand terrorism, and we're going to take a look at some of those. So the first one, for most of its long history, terrorism's impact was subnational, national, or regional, meaning it didn't really reach out, around the world. In the American psyche, the subject did not really loom large. As a matter of fact, in 2000, a Gallup poll showed 4% of Americans were very worried about terrorism, while another 20% reported that they were, just somewhat worried. Now, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, Americans changed how they lived. Basically, 33% of respondents in a national survey reduced their air travel, and 25% reported avoiding certain cities and crowded places that might be targets of terrorist attacks. So now, terrorism is no longer subnational or below the national level, or just regional, or just local. It's now transnational and global, which means that it has the capacity or the capability of reaching anywhere. And this capability leaves many people kind of worried, if you will, and it changes how some of us live. And again, I gave you these stats a second ago, but the American experience following 9/11 illustrates this point. 33% of respondents in a national survey reduce their air travel, and 25% avoid certain countries and cities because they're worried about this kind of stuff. The threat of terrorism is associated with the proliferation of preppers and survivalists. And I'm not a prepper, but I do have stuff. And these folks who are acquiring the skills, goods, and remote home sites they will need to provide for their families and groups if our government falters. So more people are thinking about that. I mean, just try to understand it at this level. Think about the COVID-19 issue, and when it first started to come out, everybody wiped everything off the shelves. You couldn't find Clorox wipes or hand sanitizer, toilet paper, and even staples, food, for a while. So the 9/11 attacks precipitated the largest and most expensive reorganization in our history. And among the changes was the creation of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. In 2 full-fledged ground wars and numerous other actions, we have spilled the blood of our men and women in the military and spent what is estimated as $1 trillion. And still, a 2016 poll revealed that 42% of Americans say they are less safe than before 9/11. So this is one of the reasons to understand terrorism, to know that it is far-reaching. Here's another reason. Terrorism can be adapted with frightening speed to the needs of many causes. It is the violent equivalent of like a Swiss Army knife, because it can be used in so many different ways and from many different directions. Some of the attacks were basically can be thought of and carried out fairly quickly by, let's say, a lone person or just a handful of people with limited resources, although a great deal of attention is focused on radicalized Muslims from abroad. Homegrown terrorists, and we're going to talk about them later, may live next door to you. In the decade after 9/11, 9 American Muslims a year have produced an average of 6 terrorist plots per year, most of which were disrupted, resulting in a total of 50 deaths. Now, the comparable annual average figures for right-wing extremist groups are 337 attacks and a total of 254 dead. And then finally, in a survey of 383 law enforcement agencies, 74% saw homegrown anti-government extremists as one of the most severe threats. And these homegrown terrorists, they have no formal connection to or receive material support from a terrorist movement, but they may have some psychological affinity with one, or even have their own particular cause. So by definition, just to kind of tell you what a homegrown terrorist is, and then we'll go over a little bit later as well. These are, again, individuals that are here like among us, and they don't have any, real support from a particular movement. They're basically homegrown individuals here in the United States that might have their own special interest, and they act on that special interest. So number 3, terrorism is not a problem unique to America. So the American preoccupation with protecting the homeland as well as citizens' interests and facilities abroad can lead us into thinking that terrorism is uniquely an American problem. Now, the data really does reveal a different picture. When you look at the top 10 countries most affected by terrorism, and we'll kind of rank them in order. So we have Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, and India. And then we have Egypt, Libya, and the Philippines. Now, again, these are the top 10 countries at the time of this textbook, and they're pretty much the same still. But now, where do you think the United States would actually fall? Well, we're not in the top 10, so you could probably figure that out. So the answer is 36. So again, a lot of times we think that terrorism is very unique. It only happens, or it's unique to the U.S. And consider this: terrorists are active around the world. In a single year, the Taliban's Islamic terrorists launched 1,093 separate attacks, creating 4,512 fatalities. And in doing so, it became that year's chief perpetrator or suspect or the one that did it, if you will, of these types of actions. And if you don't know, the Taliban straddles the Pakistan Afghanistan border. So, in one recent year, all around, there were 12,098 terrorist attacks with 29,373 deaths around the world. So hopefully this kind of tells you that it's not just a problem that happens in, America. So next, it is said that those who make their living reading crystal balls are doomed to eat broken glass. And nonetheless, we accept the risk and assert that there's going to be no quick and easy resolution to terrorism. The continuous possibility of an attack is kind of like comparing it to, living with an incurable disease. It just kind of keeps on going, and you don't know when it's going to end. So again, there really isn't an easy, quick resolution to solve all of the issues related to terrorism. Number 5, families are stressed by the deployment of, their members to combat zones, struggle to adjust if they will return with injuries, and then also, of course, grieve over their deaths. Service members who are deployed face dangers, often over multiple deployments. Their collective sacrifice gives us a measure of security, and of course, they deserve our respect. To demonstrate that respect, many people are joining efforts to help returning veterans adjust to the homecoming. And I've had several individuals in my family, in the Army, in the Navy, well, the Air Force and the Marines. So we kind of ran the gamut, I guess. So I know what it's like to sacrifice, and I'm not trying to make you feel weird, but just to kind of paint the picture of reality. The photos that you see in this presentation are my son who was killed in Iraq. So this is real. And when you talk about families that are stressed by the deployment of their members and the possibility of them not returning, that's a real thing. So that's another reason for us to really, understand all the issues relating to terrorism. And then finally, terrorism evolves and adapts, presenting a continuous series of new challenges. Now, some things kind of remain the same, but some things don't. And they're always changing, and they are always changing and adapting. And terrorists are now waging what they call a new war that has the potential to have a major impact on America's homeland without the use of those weapons of mass destruction. So if you don't remember what these are, let me kind of just enlighten you. And we'll talk more about some of these terms as we go through other chapters. And then don't forget to look at the key terms in each of the chapter as we go through. But anyway, weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, these can be nuclear, biological, chemical, radiological, or high explosive weapons capable of producing major destruction along with mass casualties or significant infrastructure damage. So, but besides this now, we're talking about this new war. And such a new war will be driven by two different components. First, crippling infrastructure by cyber attacks, which can be launched from anywhere in the world. And these cyber attacks are becoming quite a bit more frequent. And that's another field that kind of is a little bit of an offshoot from law enforcement, but it's kind of right there, would be cybersecurity. So if you're kind of one of those computer folks, this might be a great thing for you to pursue. But then the second piece that we're talking about here will also be sending these small teams, these cells, if you will, out to wreak havoc and death in many different ways, not by just WMDs or even explosives, all kinds of different ways. And I have a little note down here at the bottom, just to kind of remind myself to tell you, if you've never watched the movie American Blackout, this is kind of a movie that would, a drama that shows what things could be like if we lost all electrical power for a couple of weeks, and what would happen. And you would be surprised to see how things kind of go crazy in the movie. So if you have a chance, check it out. And I believe you could probably just find it on YouTube. So a little bit more. Terrorists have not, again, forsaken using improvised explosive devices, the IEDs or suicide bombers or attacks on specific targets, such as the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya, during 2012, which killed Ambassador Stevens and others. However, the larger new war goal of sophisticated terrorist movements opposed to the United States is to render it economically impotent and unable to throw its weight around in the Middle East. So attacking our system disruption and dealing and our money systems, if that kind of makes sense. So again, one of the concepts of terrorists under this new war are going to be directed at our infrastructure. And think about what happened, with 9/11. It crushed our financial structure. And I believe we're still feeling the effects. But to kind of define it a little more, it's called system disruption. That's the term. And it means to, of course, attacks that are concentrated on certain things that are essential to our daily lives. So, to oil pipelines, communication, transportation, electrical, water systems, and banking. And again, the 9/11 attacks illustrate this type of warfare because the towers were filled with banking, finance, insurance, and other large corporations and enterprise. So that's part of this whole system disruption, if you will, and part of the new war. Now, Al-Qaeda, if you think about 9/11, spent perhaps $250,000 on that particular, incident. And in response, America has spent over $500 billion in the decades that followed. So can you see how it really has impacted us economically? I mean, you have physical damage, the economic impact, you have homeland security related costs, you have the funding of war, any of those related costs, and future costs, veterans care. I mean, there are still claims related to 9/11. So, I mean, it's going to kind of continue on. So again, directed at our infrastructure. And as we kind of continue talking about this new war directed at our infrastructure, the term that I kind of want to bring forward to you would be called black swan events. And black swan events, these are events that are so unique, so far from the norm, and so different from other events and patterns that even analysts will have a difficult time in forecasting them or predicting them. Does that kind of make sense? So, here's an example. Safulo Saipov drove a pickup truck down a crowded bike path along the Hudson River in Manhattan, killing 8 and injuring 11. And after crashing, he was seen with a handgun and yelling Allahu Akbar before he was shot by police. So I kind of ask you, how would you forecast that? You can't really plan for it. You can't really forecast it. It's these things that happen. And by definition, again, these are, the new war type dynamics called the black swan events. And this would be considered one. So now let's talk a little bit. I discussed it just briefly as we were going through, the reasons to understand terrorism, and we talked a little bit about some different groups. But now let's kind of define a few of those so we actually know what we're talking about. So although it may send encouraging messages, homegrown terrorists, again, have no real support from a terrorist movement. And there may be some type of psychological identification with one, or homegrown terrorists may act on their own with special interests. So, and there's a couple of different examples I can give you. So one would be Faisal Shahzad, the individual that was accused of the failed Times Square bombing. So he had, he's a homegrown terrorist, but yet he did have a little bit of a connection with an outside organization. And here's actually a schematic, if you're interested, of the vehicle that he had rigged up with all of the explosives. And these are actual photographs on the night of discovery. And you can see the Nissan Pathfinder on the right with the bomb squad, etc., going through the car. And other recent examples of alleged homegrown terrorists include individuals like Nadal Malik Hassan, the Virginia-born Army major who yelled Allahu Akbar. And depending upon what you believe, it's God is great or glory to God. And then he proceeded to shoot and kill 13 and injure 31 at Fort Hood, Texas, a military base back in 2009. So you should kind of ask yourself, and this is a very interesting case study. Okay, Virginia born, so he was born here, and he's an Army major. So what happened? So, again, these are things that should make you kind of think, and this is another reason why you want to understand as much as you can. You also have lone wolf attacks or lone wolf offenders. This is a single person driven to hateful attacks based on a particular set of beliefs. Again, typically they act alone with no direction, just their own personal agenda, whatever the issue is. So the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, his issue was, if you read his manifesto, which you really should look at because it's super interesting, although it's kind of long and it is difficult to understand, but it's pretty apparent that he has an issue with the government and technology, and the rate of technology, on how things continue to change. And again, this guy was not stupid. He was extremely intelligent. So read up on him a little bit. And actually, if you click on the link, you'll get a kind of a little overview on Ted Kaczynski. So super interesting, but super intelligent as well. And then again, kind of going back to some of the reasons why we need to understand terrorism. We talked about the fact that that it doesn't just happen here. So when you look at that, terrorists are active, around the world. And in a single year, the Taliban's Islamic terrorists launched 1,093 separate attacks, creating 4,512 fatalities. In doing so, again, it became that year's #1 perpetrator of such actions. So all around the world, not just the U.S. And a little more on the Taliban, and we'll kind of get into them later, but this is a radical Islamic group. The religion of Muslims is Islam, occupying the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And they are fundamentalists that focus on strict enforcement of Sharia law, the actions and words of Muhammad, which are called the Sunnah or the Sunni, and the Quran. And if you've never seen what a Quran looks like, or what the Quran looks like, there's a photo there for you. Here's another example from October 2018, when we can look at Taliban-controlled areas, and we'll talk about Pashtun in a minute. So Taliban, just so you know, just to kind of go a little bit deeper, in Pashtu means student. And Pashtu is an Iranian language spoken in part of Pakistan and all of Afghanistan. And speakers of this language are sometimes called Pashtuns or Pakhtuns, and sometimes also Afghans or Pathans. So if we were to go back here, you can see there's areas of Taliban control in the non-Pashtun area, and then there's Taliban control in the Pashtun area. And then, of course, Al-Qaeda. These are foreign terrorist organizations. And, Al-Qaeda was formerly led by Osama bin Laden, currently led by Ayman al-Zawahiri. And he has continued the jihad against America and all of its supporters. The Islamic State, a terrorist organization and movement that has evolved to become a major international threat in 2014. Now, IS, previously known as the Islamic State in Syria, and ISIS and the Islamic State in the Levant, ISIL. IS is an evolution of radical Islamic thought, beginning with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So, a couple of different names to remember, and don't panic on all the names. Everything will be cleared up before you take any quizzes or anything like that. But I would suggest that you go through the definitions and also look at the matching exercise that is in each one of the weekly modules to help you learn some of those definitions. And here are some photos of IS, or the Islamic State. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to the concept. So we've kind of defined it. We've looked at a couple of different groups, right? And we'll get into them in more detail. But we talked about those homegrown terrorists, and those kind of extremist individuals. We talked about lone wolf terrorists. We talked a little bit about the Taliban. We talked a little bit about Al-Qaeda. And we also talked a little bit about the Islamic State. So now we want to talk about the concept of terrorism. So terrorism existed before there was a word for it. You see, the term terrorism emerged in the late 18th century in France. Early terrorism was typically, it was radical, but it was also racial, labor, and even anarchist related. And an anarchist believes in the political theory of anarchy. And pure anarchy is characterized with absence of a central government and strong cooperation between members of society. Anarchists seek to overthrow rulers and the government. Now, again, talking about where, terrorism kind of emerged from. Despite terrorist events, again, America's level of concern regarding terrorism has historically been a little bit low. And as recently as 60 years ago, it really did get little attention. It was something that happened oceans away, kind of over there in Europe and in the Middle East, as a lot of different cases illustrate. And you can look at some of those cases on page 9 and even page 10 in your textbook. But again, this is how we kind of thought of it. Years ago, we didn't really think about terrorism. We thought of it. If we did think of it, it was something that was directed at somebody else, and it only happened over there. It didn't really happen over here. Now, between the 1960s and the events of 9/11, several radical movements began to occur, or they occurred. And I'm going to go through each one just kind of generally. And there you can follow up with a little bit of information in your textbook, but I just want to go through some of them. So the first thing that we saw was Students for a Democratic Society. So again, from the 1960s to 9/11, several important radical movements, including this Students for a Democratic Society, existed in the U.S. and some terrorist attacks were launched on Americans abroad. We had the Black Panther Party in 1966. We had the Weather Underground or Weathermen in 1970 and 1971. We had the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979, where they held Americans hostage for just about a year. We had the Marine base in Lebanon in 1983, where a truck bomb killed 241 Marines and 21 others. We had the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1983, where truck bombs killed 224 and injured thousands. We had Pan Am Flight 103 in 1988, where a bomb killed 259 passengers and 11 others. So you can see a lot of things that are happening, right? We had the North Tower of the World Trade Center. This is the first time it was hit in 1993. So this was the first attack on the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 6 were killed, 1,000 injured, and 50,000 people had to be evacuated. And then finally, we have the 9/11 attack. So the attacks on September 11th, 2001 were devastating, frightening, and compelled a national response. The attacks focused on the United States, on preventing terrorism from reaching our shores. Terrorism is currently the most important word in our political vocabulary, and America annually spends billions of dollars to combat it. Now, despite America's relatively short history of dealing with terrorism, knowledgeable observers have distinguished between old and new terrorism. So, with 9/11, kind of looking back at what happened, 19 men hijacked 4 fuel-loaded U.S. commercial airplanes bound for the West Coast, different West Coast destinations. And a total of 2,977 people were killed in New York City, Washington, D.C., and outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And between 6,000 to 9,000 were injured. And as I said before, there are still claims that are being filed as a result of this, these terrorist attacks. And on the left you can see the photos of the 2 towers, and then on the right, in the upper right, you have the Pentagon, the damage, and then at the bottom right you have Flight 93 that was brought down by some very heroic passengers in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So, again, kind of just asking what the word terror means. So let's kind of define that a little bit more, because it is kind of an interesting thing. So the word terror became popular during the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794. Now, Robespierre, a Frenchman and key architect of the Reign of Terror, he believed that terror was the speedy, severe, and inflexible administration of justice. And there's now kind of a definition, if you will, between old terrorism and new terrorism. And we're going to take a little bit of, a look between the two. So old terrorism is having specific political, social, and economic goals. Because many, if not all, old terrorism goals were subnational. So they had some potential of being achieved through negotiation between the terrorist and the government. So that's kind of the old terrorism aspect. Now, the new terrorism deliberately targets unarmed civilians with the desire to inflict mass casualties. The number killed is of great importance because mass casualties create greater fear in the general population. So a radically religious interpretation undergirds many terrorist attacks. I mean, that's kind of the motivation for it, if that kind of makes sense. So the new terrorist organizational structures are more difficult to kind of see or pick out or discern, because many stem from groups that are autonomous kind of working by themselves or loosely affiliated. And you know, the new terrorism is more international. And the new terrorism inspires more lone wolf attacks. So, you know, again, it's the old type terrorism versus the new. So what is it then? So now that we've kind of taken a look at it, we've looked at, you know, we've defined it a little bit. We talked about it at the beginning. We kind of conceptualized it. I mean, we understood it. Now let's define it. So I want to get a little bit more definitive. So now we want to define what terrorism is, because that's really important. So terrorism, it's complicated to assign a specific definition. Generally, terrorism is defined as the deliberate, meaning not accident, unlawful use of threats, force, or actual violence to instill fear, intended to intimidate or coerce individuals, groups, or governments to change their political, social, religious, or ideological basis. So pay attention to those underlined terms and also the bold terms. So you're going to see some of these kind of bleed over. You're going to see some commonalities with a couple of other definitions as we start to define terrorism. So here's the FBI definition. Terrorism includes the unlawful use of force or violence. Okay, we saw that. Against any persons or property, we saw that. To intimidate or coerce, we saw that. Government, civilian population, or any segment thereof, in furtherance of political objectives. So the FBI definition, you need to have the political angle in there. And if we were to go back to some of the general information, you can see, again, political, social, religious, ideological. And then the 22nd U.S. Code and the subsections thereof defines terrorism as the premeditated. So we have kind of a new word now. And premeditated means planned. So this definition of terrorism, the planned, politically motivated violence, well, that's all in the other two definitions. Carried out against or perpetrated against non-combatant, those are just the average citizens, not another army. So non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine groups. So there you have it, a couple of different definitions. And don't forget, part of the concept of terrorism is to, you know, kind of get that fear factor out there. So when you look at this bus bombing, that not only did it cause significant damage and injuries to those that were on board the bus, but it's also going to make you wonder whether you want to take public transportation for a while. It's going to instill fear because you're going to think about it. The same with a train bombing. And I know the pictures are a little bit brutal, but it is reality. This is what you're going to see in some of these different cases. And similarly with this case, it's going to make you fear wanting to ride the train or, you know, get on any type of public transportation because you just don't trust it anymore. The Boston bombing. Think about it. The year after the bombing, would you, if you were a runner, would you run in that race? Would you even want to be a spectator? So these are all, again, the fear factor that's pushed in. Okay, especially with like car bombs. and again, vehicle bombs. So all of these are to instill fear. So now that we've got a couple of basic definitions of terrorism, let's look at the difference between domestic and foreign terrorism. Because there are some differences and there are some similarities, so let's look. So the FBI defines domestic terrorism as activities that involved acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of criminal law of the United States or of any state, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. And that's kind of a long definition. But kind of the shorter one, domestic terrorism is based and operating entirely within the United States, without any foreign direction. So those are two key points that establish domestic from international. And then the other points you'll see are similar to all the definitions that we've read. Committed against persons or property, to intimidate or coerce a government, civilian population, or any segment thereof. But, again, based and operating entirely within the United States. Now, international terrorism, on the other hand, is a foreign-based or directed by countries or groups outside of the United States, but against the United States. So just for, take 2 seconds, the 9/11 terrorism attacks, was that domestic or foreign or international? So your answer would be international. Now, maybe some of the people were here in a sleeper cell waiting to be called upon to do their whatever it is that they've signed up to do, etc. But it was driven, it was foreign-based driven, directed by countries or groups outside, but against the United States. So those, again, are a couple of examples. And then there's one other type of terrorism just that's important for us to mention. So while the new terrorism targets non-combatants, this practice is in sharp contrast to selective terrorism. So selective terrorism is a tactic advocated by Michael Collins, the commander of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. And instead of using unfocused, indiscriminate violence that may, that killed many people, selective terrorism focuses on the people and the institutions that supported the enemy. Does that kind of make sense? So it's a sharp contrast to that new terrorism. So I'm kind of hoping that really does make sense to everybody. And if you need to, you can go back and you can kind of look at the difference again between new terrorism or old. But again, it is a sharp contrast to the new terrorism. Because, new terrorism targets, again, non-combatants. And this selective terrorism doesn't indiscriminately, just go out there and kill people, but it selectively focuses on those people and institutions that support the enemy. So again, kind of an interesting concept. And again, Michael Collins, commander of the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, and an advocate of selective terrorism. So let's take a look now at different perspectives, individual perspectives, and even culture. And if need be, we'll take a break, and then we can come back for part two. And part two probably won't be too long. Actually, this may not be a bad time to go ahead and break. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll call this part 1 of chapter 1. And when we come back, we'll jump into part 2.